Hi, everyone. My name is Lena Ryan, and I am today's expert for Laurie Voss session. Laurie is a data evangelist in Netlify, and he's a co-founder of NPM. And his talk is about web development in 2021. And Laurie suggests us to look at a whole picture of what tools developers use and how they use it and maybe why they use it. And hey, Laurie.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, this is why I love technologies, because you're near San Francisco and I'm in St. Petersburg and we still can talk like this. And this is amazing.
Indeed.
So, yeah, speaking about your today's talk, is it more for beginners to understand what to start with, or is it more for experienced developers to help them see a whole picture of web development?
Well, I think it's got a lot of content. I make sure that it's accessible to beginners. So a lot of the technologies that I'm talking about, I explain what they are. But the actual data about how popular these technologies are, whether they're loved or not, all of that kind of stuff, that's new information that we got as a result of the research that led to this talk. So even pretty advanced users will find that to be news.
Okay, this is great. Well, I'm excited, and I think our viewers are excited too. So please, dear viewers, you may leave your questions in chat, and after Laurie's talk, we will have a discussion where Laurie will answer your questions. So, Laurie, let's get started.
Okay, great. So, hello, everyone. Oh no, my slides have frozen. There we go. Excellent. Hi. Like Lena said, my name is Laurie. I work at Netlify at the moment, where my title is Data Evangelist. The evangelist title means that I talk at conferences. Apparently, that's the definition of an evangelist. As Lena said, I work at Netlify right now. Before Netlify, I co-founded NPM Inc., which you may have heard of. And before that, I co-founded a company called Awesome, which I'm sure that you didn't. But what I am is a web developer. I care about the web, and I'm interested in the web, and I love making the web bigger and better. I started web development in 1996, and I've been in love with the web ever since. So when I'm giving a talk, I always like to kick off by telling you what you're going to get out of it, because otherwise, why would you invest all of your time and attention in learning this stuff? So my goal today is to give you a sense of where modern web development is today. Because too often developers work in a vacuum, an information vacuum. We don't know if the tools that we're using are the cutting edge or they are old and obsolete. And knowing where you stand can help you make better technical choices. It can give you new things to learn. It can tell you that you're using an old tool that it's time to move away from. Or maybe it just gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling because you know you've already made the right choices. But the way that I'm doing that is I'm using statistical data about what web developers are currently doing. So that means a lot of what I'm going to be telling you is what is popular, what's getting more popular, what is getting less popular, and how much people using those things enjoy using them. But a popular choice is obviously not the same as the best choice. Luckily, I have a lot of data, so I can tell you not just what's popular, but I can give you a framework to help you decide what's best for you. Everybody's needs and constraints are different. So in addition to telling you what's generally popular, I'll also be breaking out some groups like enterprise developers and e-commerce developers and people who build very large websites, all of whom turn out to be quite different from the population in general. So that is what I want to tell you. But how the heck do I know all of that stuff? The answer is I asked people. In a pair of surveys in 2020 and 2021, we got over 10,000 responses to our questions about modern web development. 10,000 responses, if you're a statistician, is gold medal level quality of data. We use surveys of like 1,000 people to predict the outcome of national elections. So using 10,000 people to talk about web development is really quite accurate. The questions that we asked covered a number of topics, but we have 3 big sections. So I'm going to cover who we are as web developers, what we're doing, what types of applications, what they do, what they target, and finally, how we're doing it. That's going to be the bulk of the content. That's going to be an overview of current technical choices and how to select between them. But obviously, no survey is perfect. I ran this survey on behalf of Netlify, and Netlify is a particular kind of web host. We specialize in a kind of development called the Jamstack, which focuses on a performant pre-rendered front end using APIs to dynamically fetch data and delivered by a CDN. Jamstack is a very popular model for websites these days, but obviously it is not the only one. So the data is a little bit biased towards those sorts of developers. So while I've tried to correct for that, and I'm going to be talking about web development in general and not just the Jamstack, you should keep that bias in mind and keep me honest. In particular, because Jamstack cares very much about the front end, the data is mostly about front end technologies. There are a few back end technologies that we're going to cover, especially in the framework section, but more often I'll be talking about using existing APIs, which is how the Jamstack tends to do things. So back end developers, this is going to be a little bit less useful for you, but even back end developers will find some content here. Other than these surveys I run, where could you get this kind of data? One place is the NPM public API. I'm going to refer to it at one point. When I ran NPM, that was how I did this, in addition to running surveys at NPM. And I still double check my work against NPM data. Google also has an excellent resource called the HTTP archive, which has tons of data about what Google's crawler is seeing out on the web. But you can't always tell what choices somebody made technically by looking at the HTML that's being generated. So asking people in a survey is still the gold standard for figuring out what it is that they're doing. Throughout this talk, I'm going to pause periodically to try and explain what the data means, because data by itself is not that useful. You have to get a story of what is going on. You have to figure out what it's trying to tell you. And there's going to be a Q&A after my talk, but I will also be asking questions of myself during the talk, because data is fascinating and knowing answers always poses new questions. So I'll be sharing some of my questions about my own data with you. So let's get into it. Let's start with who we are. And the most obvious thing to ask about who we are is, what is your job? As you can see in our survey data, 82% of respondents were engineers. You can also see how they were split up. 45% front-end, 32% full stack, only 5% back-end. Clearly, that's not all web developers. The bias in this sample towards the front-end is clear. So if you're a front-end or full-stack engineer, this data is going to be especially useful for you. And if you're a back-end engineer, maybe take it with a grain of salt. The other thing that we looked at is employment status. Most people in our sample work full-time, only 10% of contractors, which was a surprise to me. And there's a huge cohort of students, which for a survey of Jamstack developers is great news. Students are taking to the Jamstack as the default way to learn to build and deploy websites. And that's usually a great sign for the future growth and health of our community. With the growth in student population, Jamstack developers saw a fall in the average level of experience from our 2020 survey to our 2021 survey, but we still have a pretty solid distribution. More than 50% of devs in our sample say that they have more than 5 years of experience. There was also a fun discovery that happened when we tried splitting developers up by their level of experience and what region of the world they were in at the same time. We weren't really expecting to find a pattern here at all, but instead we found this. In the most experienced group, 15 years or more, developers are concentrated in North America and the EU. Only 15% of devs in the 15-year experience bracket come from outside those two regions. But in the least experienced group, that rises to 48%. What's going on there is it seems like we're watching the evolution of a developer community by sort of peeling back layers of experience levels. more developers are breaking into the industry from more places, and we're hoping that this greater geographical diversity will improve other kinds of diversity in the development community as well. We used to ask developers what industry their company is in, and they'd nearly all say tech, which is sort of true, but also sort of unhelpful. So now we ask two questions. First, we ask, is your company a tech company? And 74% of people say that it is, which is kind of strange because I don't think 74% of the economy is in tech. But it seems to be about how developers view their own companies. Because then if we ask developers what industry their company is in, only 39% say that it's in tech. So it's a tech company, but not in tech. And the rest are split across dozens of industries. It's a true cross-section of the economy, which is what you'd expect to see. This being 2021, one of the other things that we asked developers is about the pandemic and how it has affected their lives. Obviously, the pandemic has affected everyone and everything, but we were interested in this case about how it has changed the working habits of web developers specifically. We asked a very, very specific question. We asked, did your job go remote as a result of the pandemic, and will it stay remote even after the pandemic is done? Despite that being a very specific situation, 31% of people said, yes, that is what happened to me. In fact, the effect is even stronger when you split people up by experience again. People in the first 2 years of their careers were more likely, they were less likely to have gone remote. They were more likely to have lost their job as a result of the pandemic. After those first 2 years, however, nearly 40% of people said that they went remote and are staying remote. That is a huge, huge change to the way that developers live and work. And it is still too early. We are just at the beginning of seeing what kind of global effects that big a change in working patterns is going to have. There was a second pattern to the pandemic effects that we found when we split by job title. Again, excluding people in those first 2 years, we found that DevOps are the most likely to have gone remote. And backend engineers are close behind them. Content producers, management, and designers were the least likely to have gone remote. I can't back this up with data, but what appears to be happening is that the number of meetings that you have in your job is predicting how likely you are to go remote. Fewer meetings means that you are more likely to go remote. So what story should we take from all of this demographic data? Well, you should take it to help you understand who this data is really about. Clearly, it's about a big chunk of web developers, but it's not going to be true about everybody. But it is still some of the best data that the industry has about the working lives of web developers, even though I'm being upfront about its imperfections. So now we know what who we are talking about. What are all of these people doing? There's lots of ways to ask that question, but the most obvious thing to ask is, what is the site that you're building for? What does it do? Lots of people work on more than one thing in a year, so we allowed people to give multiple answers, so all of these answers add up to well over 100. The top answer, which I think is hilarious, is personal sites and blogs. Whatever else you work on over the course of a year, you find time to work on your own personal website, and so it is the #1 answer. I think that's neat, personally. Innovation in the web is driven by curious developers trying things out and experimenting on their personal websites. So the indie web isn't dead, and I like that. But let's look at those other categories. Business to business, B2B, and business to consumer, B2C, are 35 and 33% respectively. And it's not news to economists, but I think it's news to a lot of people that there is as much money to be made selling from one business to another business as there is selling from a business to other people. It's also not news to anyone that e-commerce at 34% is one of the driving economic forces of the web. Not all B2B or B2C businesses consider themselves to be e-commerce. But I think an aspect of that is surprising is that lead capture, all by itself, is way up there at 29%. It begins to explain to me why whenever I land on any website these days, they pop up this annoying modal dialog that asks me for my email, because it turns out lead capture is a huge category all by itself. Similarly huge at 29% is internal tools. The story that I want you to think about here is how much attention do you pay to these categories respectively? How much time and attention does your team spend on internal tools versus lead capture versus everything else that you do? Are you focusing too much on some things and not enough on others? What does it mean for your career and what you spend time learning? The next question we asked is about how dynamic your site is. We had options from a totally static, pre-rendered flat site to fully dynamic sites, and also single-page applications, which are not quite the same thing. In this question, we made sure to ask about all sites that people worked on, not just Jamstack sites. We had a separate question for Jamstack sites. So the answer here is, across all types of websites that people work on, the answers are pretty much the same. I think that might be considered a boring answer, that a static site and a dynamic site are equally likely, but I think that's a fascinating result because we spend as much time creating totally static websites as we do fully dynamic single-page apps. Does it feel like we spend an equal amount of time making the tooling for those two types of applications? The huge boom in the popularity of static site generators that I'm going to talk about later, that seems like it's driven by this data. Another way to ask what we're building is what devices we're building it for. For the last few years, the mantra of thought leaders in web development has been mobile first. You should build your site to work on a phone and then add desktop features later. In the US, 88% of consumer internet time is spent browsing the web on mobile devices. So that seems like it should be sound advice. Are we following that advice? No, we are not. Desktop is still the most important target to us, with 98% of people saying that it is either somewhat or very important as a target. Phones came second at 94%, which is pretty close, and tablets are at 91%, but that gap is bigger than it sounds. Because if you ask people if it's very important that they target that device, 84% of people say the desktop is very important, but only 71% say phones, and less than half say tablets. So this is one of those places where the data creates a question. We say that desktop is more important than mobile, and that sounds right to me, by which I mean that sounds accurate. That sounds like how we really work. But is that good news? Is mobile first bad advice? Or should we be listening more closely to the people who say mobile first? How would you answer that question, is the question I have for you. Similarly to asking the importance of mobile, we asked developers about their priorities in other areas and got them to rank them. We asked this question in both 2020 and 2021, and we got similar answers both times, although security ranked higher this year than it did last year. The number one answer is performance, and after that is uptime. So we want our websites to be fast, and implicitly, it is okay if they're down sometimes, if that makes them fast, which is an interesting implication. Security is third, and compliance is fifth. So think about that in terms of priorities again. We're saying that it's okay for the website to leak data. It's okay for it to be insecure as long as it stays up and it works fast. We're also saying that it's okay if it violates privacy laws as long as it's up and it works fast and it's secure. Is that right? I don't know that those are the correct priorities, but they're certainly the accurate priorities, because the web is full of fast websites that break all the time and violate user privacy all the time and leak data all the time. So that's actually how we work, whether or not that's how we should be working. All of these priorities have fascinating implications. The lowest priority is avoiding vendor lock-in. If you spend any time in the open source world, you will know that people hate vendor lock-in. Everybody wants their stuff to be portable and not tied to a specific vendor, except apparently we don't, at least not as much as we want anything else. And our final question about what we're doing is about how big the audience is that we're doing it for. Here again, people work on lots of sites so they could give multiple answers. And the most common size of audience is thousands of users. By web standards, that scale is pretty small. And one of the advantages of Jamstack is that because it's on a CDN, it scales really well to millions of users. But websites that only have thousands of users don't need that kind of scale. What they need is performance and uptime. So people are looking at CDNs for those rather than scale. In fact, it's very instructive to compare our audience size data with our priorities data, because if performance is your goal, then at scale, you should be able to use caching. But at smaller user sizes, and by smaller I mean only a few thousand users, a slow site that caches and becomes fast, that's going to be a bad user experience. If you'd want to pre-render it so that even the very first user gets a fast experience. And we also know that from our data that fully dynamic sites are almost as common as other kinds, and fully dynamic sites can't be cached by definition. You can't pre-render them because they're going to be different for every single user on every single page load. So there you have to get performance in other ways, like pushing personalization and pushing customization to the edge, which I'm going to look at later. So we've now arrived at our third section, the real core of our data, which is our technology choices. This is not who's doing it or what we're doing, but how. We have some special ways of measuring this stuff, and it's worth taking a second to explain. You're going to see a lot of graphs in the next section that look like this, with technologies and bubbles. This graph is showing three different things at the same time. The first is awareness. Has somebody heard of this technology at all? That is going to be the size of the bubble. So big bubbles are very well known, like WordPress, and small bubbles are not very well known, like forestry. The next is usage. Is somebody using this technology, sometimes or often? That is the horizontal axis. So the further over to the right you are, the more users your technology has. And the final metric is satisfaction. This is the vertical axis. For every technology that we surveyed, we asked people not just whether they used it, but whether they wanted to use it more or they wanted to use it less. And we put those numbers in a ratio. So if more people want to use the technology more, the satisfaction score goes up. And if more people want to use the technology less, then the satisfaction score goes down. The dividing line is 1.0. So below 1.0, your users are unhappy, and above 1.0, your users are happy with your technology. For some of the technologies we surveyed, we surveyed about them in both 2020 and 2021. So for those, we can show these year-on-year graphs. They are also usage and satisfaction, but they're showing how those things changed from year to year. One pattern that you're going to see in this data over and over is that growing technologies have users who get less happy. And the mechanism here is pretty simple. When you are small, when you are new, the users who are using your technology are early adopters. They like your technology. They liked it enough to get over the early bumps of a new technology. And so their use case is also probably a great match for what your technology is good at. But later in your technology's life, it gets more popular. And now some users will be using your tech for use cases that are not so good for what it does. And some are probably using it without having any say in the matter. Somebody else made that choice, and so they're just using it because they have to. So we'll see this over and over. As tech gets bigger, its users generally get less happy. The first technology choice that we looked at was the first part of the technical design process, which is design itself. This is a great example of how these graphs work. You can see that everybody has heard of Adobe XD. That bubble is huge. But the usage is only 36%, and its satisfaction is 1.4, so its users are happy. But Figma blows it and everything else away. Figma's usage is 62% and has a satisfaction score of 8.8. Figma is really dominating the design segment at the moment. The other tools in the survey about design, nearly all had satisfaction scores below 1.0. Users of those tools are more likely to want to stop using it than to want to use it more. The exception was Framer, which has the smallest usage at 11%, but its satisfaction score of 2.2. A big category of our questions was CMS, or content management systems. The reason we spent a lot of time on it is because of another question that we asked, which was, what third-party APIs do you use? The most popular one was authentication, but there's no mystery to how authentication works. If you're using a third-party authentication service, then you're going to be letting people log in using Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, something like that. So there's nothing there to ask about. But content management systems, the field there is much more crowded. Because there are so many, we had to split CMS up into three main groups. The first group is traditional CMS. The unsurprising leader here is WordPress at 39%, with Drupal at 13%. Both have low satisfaction scores, under 1.0, and users of Forestry and Ghost are a lot happier. There's a newer group and a more crowded group called headless CMS. These don't provide any design input. They just allow you to supply and edit content and provide an API that allows you to incorporate that content into your site. WordPress can also work this way. And in headless mode, it's also quite popular. And most importantly, when WordPress is configured in headless mode, its satisfaction score rises. It's at 1.1. But in this category, Contentful is the leader, and its users are twice as happy as WordPress users. A newer category in the CMS space is what I'm calling the design-led CMS. These tools make the visuals of the content a priority, and they provide sophisticated visual editors, often with libraries of templates to get started. A surprising leader here in terms of usage is Wix, although its satisfaction is well below 1.0. Webflow is both popular and has happy users, as does Builder. Putting all of this together, you can get a broader picture of the CMS space. You can see that WordPress is the strongest by usage, Sanity is the strongest by satisfaction, and Contentful is the most popular one that still has happy users. But now let's look at year-on-year changes. We weren't tracking everybody in this group last year, so we don't have year-on-year changes for everybody, but you can see some big changes in the ones we did. Strappy and Sanity both gained a lot of usage, and lost steeply in satisfaction. That is the pattern that I mentioned that we would see. Keep in mind, they both have very high satisfaction. Their users are both very happy. They're just less happy than they were last year because it's no longer just early adopters. The other obvious change of note is WordPress, which is losing usage. And although its users are unhappy, unsurprisingly, the ones who stuck with it are the ones who are happiest with it. So the happiness of WordPress users has gone up. So that's a lot about CMS. What should we take away from it? Well, there's no clear winner. That's what you should take away. I would say that headless CMS of the three groups as a category is currently the strongest one, and that Contentful is the leader there. Strappy and Sanity are strong options to look at. And if you want a strong visual editor, Webflow seems to be the right choice. Now, just a very quick question, which was about people's editors. I asked this one because I was trying to find out if people use online code editors to write code. Like, do you use code spaces from GitHub or something like that? But I failed to differentiate between that and editing code in like WordPress's online editor. So it didn't. This answer didn't give me the data that I wanted, but it did give me at least one useful data point, which is that IDEs are way more popular than Vim. As a lifelong non-fan of Vim, I've always been told that real coders use Vim, and now I have data that suggests otherwise. Even if real coders do use Vim, sometimes they also use IDEs because everybody uses IDEs, 96% of people. Our next set of data is about programming languages. I'm not going to be recommending a programming language because everyone's tastes are strong and different. But it's interesting to see the breakdown of how people are using languages in the web development space. Our first question was, what is your primary programming language? We asked about 17 different languages, but this is the top 10. Unsurprisingly, JavaScript is the choice because we are web developers, but PHP and Python are both popular choices. But the surprise here, I think, is TypeScript. TypeScript claims to be just JavaScript, but TypeScript developers don't seem to think so. They call themselves TypeScript developers. They identify TypeScript as their primary language, not JavaScript. TypeScript is already a very popular choice, and as we're going to see in a bit, it's growing very fast. So let's get our usual usage and satisfaction graph for all of these languages. Here, respondents could list every language they used, not just the primary one, and there were some surprises in that. JavaScript is nearly universal at 96% usage, but at 67%, the next most used language is good old SQL. TypeScript is very strong here as well at 60%, and Bash comes in the low 50s. It's worth looking at the 1.0 mark of satisfaction. Below it, we find PHP, Java, Perl, Visual Basic, and every flavor of C except C#. Python at 42% has almost as many users as PHP, but Python users are very happy, unlike PHP users whose satisfaction is well below 1. Then there's this cluster off to the right that I call the new class. Rust, Go, Swift, and Elixir. The biggest one is Go, which is 15% usage, and all of the others are under 10%, but their users are super happy, and that is a good sign for their future growth. But obviously, this is about web developers, and it's not about the programming world at large. Java is not running a distant seventh place in the programming world at large. If you look at Redbunk's data, it says it's third, but we're web developers, so this stuff is still interesting to know. What about year-on-year changes? Well, there's a lot to talk about here, so let's take it in these 4 quadrants. First and most obviously, in the top right, TypeScript has gained tons and tons of share. And its users are getting happier. That is not the usual trend. Usually I would expect them to get less happy. But there are lots of other languages in this quadrant. Most of them haven't changed very much, but Python is an exception, climbing nearly 7% in usage and climbing in satisfaction as well. Go users also got happier this year. Over in the bottom right, we have what I consider to be a more normal pattern: Rust and Swift gaining users very rapidly and falling from their earlier sky-high satisfaction. As we saw before, both users of both are amongst the happiest users out there. This is just what growth tends to look like. In the top left, we see 3 languages whose satisfaction has barely changed, but they're losing users. PHP has barely changed at all, really, but Ruby and Bash are losing share. And the final very obvious change here is JavaScript. JavaScript users are getting less happy and fewer people are using JavaScript. Where are they going? The obvious conclusion seems to be that they're going to TypeScript and that they are happier in TypeScript than they were in JavaScript. That, I think, shows that there is a larger problem for the JavaScript language, which is that it is overextended. If you want to make a website in 2021, you have to use JavaScript or at least TypeScript. That is not good. It's not good for JavaScript. It's not good for users. It means people who don't like JavaScript have to use it even though they hate it. People who aren't happy in a language are not going to write it well. We have to free the web from JavaScript. One possible route for doing that is WebAssembly, also known as WASM. WASM provides a mechanism for any programming language to be compiled down to a simple form and then executed at near native speeds directly inside of a browser. People have already done this with Rust and Go, and you can even do it with PHP and Python if you also compile down the interpreter. This is a very exciting development for web development. At the moment, WASM is still in its infancy. A web app written in WASM has some technical limitations and some performance limitations, but it is getting very close to being ready. So if you hate JavaScript and the data says that there are a lot of you who hate JavaScript, then consider checking it out. So, what does this all mean for you? In languages, it means that JavaScript remains inescapable, at least for the moment, but learning TypeScript looks like a good choice, or at least good for your career. I think of TypeScript as being a big project choice. It is essentially automated testing, and tests are great as a team scales up. On small projects, I would still prefer to use JavaScript, but then I liked JavaScript to begin with, so what do I know? Now for another very quick question. We didn't ask a lot about backend technologies, like I said, but we were interested in what people were using on the backend. And some answers here were obvious and unsurprising. Containers like Docker and orchestration like Kubernetes are very popular. And also lots of people use microservices. But there was a surprise, and it was serverless functions. Netlify has built-in support for serverless functions, so obviously we are big fans. But we were not prepared for the usage to be at 46%. That means nearly half of developers are using serverless functions now. That makes it an extremely mainstream choice. And I want to think about the implications there for a second. We saw earlier that fully dynamic sites are just as popular as totally static sites, but also that performance is a very high priority. It's very hard to get truly stellar performance if you have to generate every single web page on the fly. So how do you reconcile those? How do you do dynamic but high performance? One possible solution is serverless functions. Serverless functions run on the edge. They run on the CDN. And the popularity of serverless functions, I think, is explained by this simultaneous need to prioritize performance with fully dynamic personalized sites. Our final and biggest question was about web frameworks. There are thousands of web frameworks. People constantly argue about them, what's good and what's bad, and how to use them properly. But before we dive into it, I want to step back for a second and ask, why use a framework at all? Believe it or not, there was a time before web frameworks were invented, and I was a web developer back then too. And I was there, and I can tell you that it sucked. Every company had their own special snowflake of a web app, and they all did roughly the same thing, but they all worked totally differently. So hiring somebody to work on your app was a process that took weeks or months. They had to slowly learn the architecture and the idioms that your company had invented. Then Ruby on Rails came along. It wasn't the first framework, but it was the first to really hit mass adoption. And it changed the game. Suddenly, hiring somebody to work on your web app just meant hire somebody who knows Rails. They could start the next day. And already they knew how your app worked because it was a Rails app and they all worked the same way. That sounds simple, but it was revolutionary at the time. And the massive time savings unlocked by that propelled whole new companies into being. And that's true even though Ruby had some real performance issues at the time, and Rails is still not my favorite framework. The advantage of a framework is not really a technical one, it's a human one. Having other people know how your web app works is a massive benefit. It almost doesn't matter what framework you pick because they're all going to help you go faster, because more people will help you find bugs, more people will be able to answer your questions, more people will ship plugins for your framework, and more people will write documentation for it. And above all, you can hire people who already know the framework. Frameworks may claim to help you scale your app at a technical level, and some of them may even do that, but what they definitely do is help you scale your team. So obviously I'm pro framework, but there are some counter arguments. One is that adding a framework can create performance problems, but to me that is an argument against a specific framework, some kinds of frameworks, because other frameworks produce completely flat HTML exactly the same as if you wrote it yourself. The biggest argument against a framework is that if you pick the wrong one, you can end up using an unpopular one, and then all of the advantages of a framework become disadvantages. Nobody knows your framework, nobody wants to work on it, and you can't hire anymore. This happens all the time, so you want to avoid it. This graph is based on NPM's data about how frameworks grow and die. I'm not going to go into a full explanation because it's pretty technical. But what it's trying to show is that frameworks have a pretty predictable life cycle. Any framework that you pick, it tends to grow fast for 3 to 5 years and then begin to very slowly decline, at least relative to other frameworks. So if you're looking at picking a framework, you're looking for one that's in that happy path. You're looking for one that's in those first 3 to 5 years. In our survey, we asked about 32 different frameworks. Like CMSs, that is so many, we had to split them up into some groups. The first is a very small group called component libraries. These are frameworks that aren't full frameworks. They do the very basics, and they expect you to build the rest or use an additional framework on top of them. The most famous of those is React. The next group is the kitchen sink frameworks. They do everything and the kitchen sink. You'll probably recognize Next and Nuxt in there, and some older alternatives like Angular and Ember. Then there's static site generators, or SSGs. These are unframeworks. They produce flat HTML that gets delivered to the user just as if you'd written HTML yourself, with little or no JavaScript client side. They save you a lot of work on the server side by pre-rendering. Then there's a couple special purpose frameworks. Docusaurus is a popular option for making documentation sites specifically, and Stencil is a framework for generating web components, by which I mean browser-native web components. One thing I'm not tracking in this data that I promise to do a better job in future is tracking the usage of browser-native web components. Browsers have had native support for web components for quite some time, and there are some famous large-scale implementations like at Salesforce, but their usage is distributed and kind of hard to track. So it's been kind of a blind spot for me. And their usage is somewhere under 10% right now, but I'm not sure exactly where, so I'm keeping my eye on them. There are also some legacy frameworks that still have a ton of usage that we track, like jQuery and Backbone. And there's also one final framework that I wish I'd tracked. It's Astro. It's very exciting, but also very new. So I didn't track it, and I wish that I had. So now let's look at the actual data. In component libraries, React is huge. 98% of people are aware of it, and 67% of people are using it. We're going to talk about React a little bit more in a bit. Vue is also a very popular choice, although many less people are aware of it, and Svelte is doing pretty well. Now let's look at SSGs. The winner in this category is Gatsby. We'll see later why that choice might not be so simple. 11T is small, but it has huge satisfaction. And now we get to a very crowded category, which is the kitchen sink frameworks. Nearly half of the frameworks we looked at fell into this category. The major outliers are already clear. Next.js, which is closely tied to React, has 43% usage and sky-high satisfaction. Nuxt, which is closely associated with Vue, is roughly as popular relative to Next as Vue is to React. So it's about half at 25%. SvelteKit is tied to Svelte, obviously, and it corresponds roughly to the popularity of that library with 8% usage. Vite is a newcomer and a bit of an exception because it's not tied to any particular library. It can work with React or Vue or Svelte and a number of other component models. It can also be configured to work like an SSG, which is true of several of these frameworks. So Vite has amazing satisfaction, and its usage is already at 14%. There are two very popular frameworks called Angular, which have very little to do with each other. One is called Angular 1, or AngularJS, and it's older. And the newer one is called Angular 2 onwards, or just Angular. And I find this very confusing myself. I don't know why they didn't just give them different names, but they're both still quite popular. AngularJS is at 15%, and Angular 2 onwards is at 20%. However, their satisfaction scores are both below 1.0. In this graph, right on top of each other, are Nest and VuePress. VuePress is sort of the precursor to Vite, and Nest is like next to Nuxt, but it is for Angular. And at this point, the graph is getting too crowded to see anything, so let's zoom in. These are the remaining small frameworks. Everybody's usage is under 7%, and they show the standard pattern of popularity. The bigger you are, the less they like you. This is a mix of very old and very new frameworks. Ember, Meteor, and Happy are older. Redwood.js, Remix, and Blitz are all very new. Remix is so new that they don't even let the public use it yet, and yet somehow it reached 3% usage, so I guess the people in the beta are really, really enjoying it. Here are the other frameworks we tracked. It's a very mixed bag. Express is huge and well-loved. 51% of people are using Express for something. jQuery is exactly as huge. 51% of people say that they use jQuery, but it is not loved at all. It is well under 1.0. Backbone is still hanging in there at 8%, and Dojo, the oldest of all, is at 3%. Docusaurus and Stencil are new and small and well-liked. Earlier, I mentioned that serverless functions are at 46% usage, and that's interesting because some of these frameworks can be used in multiple ways. Several work as SSGs, but can also work as a traditional server-side framework, or they can also work as a serverless framework. Next.js and Redwood.js can both work that way. And 11T has support for serverless functions to do on-demand generation. So the whole category of frameworks and how they work and whether they're dynamic and how they interact with serverless functions is getting pretty blurry. Now let's look at our other type of data, the year-on-year changes. This is going to tell us more than mere popularity. First, in the top right, React has grown while maintaining satisfaction. That is a huge accomplishment when it's already so big. 67% of people are using it, and it is still making them happier than they were before. But Next.js is even bigger, or rather grew even faster. They added 20% more shares since last year, and they also managed to improve their satisfaction, which is incredibly impressive. Over in the bottom right, we see the pattern that we've come to expect. 11T, Nest, Preact, and VuePress, they form this neat straight line going down and to the right. The bigger they got, the more satisfaction that they shed. The same happened, although less so, to bigger frameworks like Vue and Svelte and Nuxt. In the top left, we have some frameworks that declined a little or didn't change that much. AngularJS is in there. Angular 2+ gained a little bit of share. And that big blue blob that you can barely see is jQuery, which is only very, very slowly declining. In the bottom left, all by itself, is Gatsby. Still the leader in SSGs by market share. Its share has declined since last year, and its satisfaction fell as well. That is very unusual, and that is bad news for a very nice team. So it's time to think about what all of this means for us. Is there a clear winner in frameworks? I don't think so, but there are some strong choices. First, a component library is a good idea. React is the biggest one, and it's still gaining share, so it's a solid choice. But even if React is not your bag, a framework that uses a component library it seems a stronger choice to me than one that doesn't, just because these things have really big user bases, and a really big user base is the thing that makes a framework useful. Do you need a kitchen sink framework at all? For a small project, maybe not. For something larger, I would pick one myself. Next.js is a clear leader here. Nuxt is a strong alternative. Vite is new and exciting. And SvelteKit, I think, has strong potential. The others in the category are less obviously good options. Let's think back to our earlier data about static sites and the importance of mobile. These frameworks often come with substantial JavaScript infrastructure that takes time to load and time to execute. If you just want the fastest possible site, you just want static plain HTML, then here your best choice is either going to be Gatsby if you really love GraphQL, and probably Eleventy if you don't. But you probably want some kind of framework. Unless you're working entirely by yourself and you don't care how long it takes you, a framework is going to help you go faster and do more with less work and help you find teammates to help. An alternative on the horizon is the so-called no-code movement. Webflow is the loudest fan of this idea, and I really love the idea of people putting together websites without having to write code or without having to write much code. I think that more people should make websites, and I think the best way to do that is to make it as easy as possible. I long for the 1996 when you could learn all of web development in an afternoon. But I don't think no-code is living up to that name yet. Maybe it will one day. The last thing I want to mention when I'm talking about frameworks is the potential future for React. As we saw, React is enormous, way bigger than its nearest competitor and bigger than anything else out there. The only framework that I'm aware of that was ever bigger than React is now was jQuery, and that is an important historical parallel because jQuery never died. People don't say that they use jQuery anymore, but that is because something happened. Browser manufacturers took the APIs invented by jQuery and they built them into the browser. You don't need to install jQuery anymore because it's built into the fabric of the web. It didn't die, it transcended. So could something like that happen to React? I can't say for certain, but what happens if React reaches 75% share or 80 or 90%? At that point, browser makers probably need to stop and think about how to bring these idioms that developers clearly love to the native web. One potential snag is that the web platform already has a standard for components called imaginatively web components. Will they replace React? They don't seem to have done so yet, but like I said earlier, I'm not tracking them very well. Would someone bring React-type developer experience to web components? I think that would be a great idea. Whew. So that's a ton of data. But if you're the kind of person that I am, it may have left you a little bit unsatisfied because sure, that's what people in general are using, but that's not right for me. You're right. Data about broad populations can hide a lot of subtlety. Luckily, we have a lot of data, so we can take a brief, closer look at some individual populations and see how they're different. So if you'll bear with me, we'll just quickly zip through those. The first group that's interesting was people who build sites for very large audiences. I'm going to call them big sites for short, but I mean big in terms of audience and not in the number of pages. People who work on big sites are demographically different. They have more specialized job titles. There are fewer full-stack developers, more front-end, back-end, and more people call themselves content producers. This makes sense because big sites require big teams, and bigger teams have more specialized roles. People who work on big sites are also on average more experienced. They also have different priorities. Compliance, which we said earlier was not a big deal for most people, is a much bigger deal for people who work on very large sites. And again, that makes sense because getting sued at very large scale is very expensive. People who work on big sites also care more about mobile, which again matches intuition. They need to reach the widest possible audience, so they have to address every kind of device. And finally, people who work on big sites have a preference for certain frameworks. They are more likely to use React and Next.js, even more so than the population in general. Another group that I looked at was students, purely out of curiosity. The results weren't very useful, but they were kind of funny. Students have very clear and distinct preferences, but there's no consistency to them. Their trend is wild variability. They use a bunch of really old frameworks that nobody's using anymore, and they also use a bunch of really new frameworks that no one has started using yet, and they use both of those at the same time with equal levels of enthusiasm, which I think is hilarious. A more obviously useful breakout is to look at enterprise developers. Enterprise software is a big category and there's a lot of money. So, how are they different? 3 big ways. The most unsurprising finding is that enterprises use more heavyweight tooling for their backends, above average adoption of everything: containers, orchestration, microservices, API gateways, everything. Enterprises use it all. Enterprises also care less about mobile than any other group. Enterprise software, it seems, is still mostly a desktop affair. So if you're an enterprise developer, maybe mobile first isn't for you. And finally, enterprises use TypeScript more than most other groups. As I mentioned earlier, TypeScript really shines when you're part of a big team, and enterprises are nothing if not big. And our final breakout is e-commerce. It's a huge category, and developers deep into e-commerce have some notably different priorities. Their preferences are notable because they're almost exactly the opposite of enterprise developers in every way. Firstly, they use none of the heavier tooling. They use a lot of serverless functions. They use a lot of third-party APIs. They use asset management systems for images, and they use third-party databases. They also care more about phones. They consider phones and tablets more important targets than any other group. And to complete the picture, they also use TypeScript less. E-commerce folks are using plain JavaScript, and I don't have any reason why that they would do that. It's just kind of funny because it's, again, the mirror of enterprise. So this has been a ton of information, and thank you so much for paying attention. In case your attention wandered or you lost consciousness through sheer boredom of one graph too many, let's quickly recap what I've talked about so far. Demographically, we found a few things. Full stack developers are the most common. Developers are getting more geographically diverse. 40% of people went remote in the pandemic, except for the newer folks who lost their jobs, and DevOps people were more likely to go remote. In terms of what we learned, we learned consumer businesses and B2B are almost equally big. Some very specific categories like lead capture and landing pages are the focus of a huge number of people, and everybody works on internal tools, and we maybe don't give them enough attention. We found that static and dynamic sites get built almost as often as each other, and that we don't care about mobile devices as much as thought leaders say we should, unless you work in e-commerce, in which case you do. We care about performance and uptime, even if it means that our websites are insecure or illegal, which is something that we should reflect on as humans. And finally, we looked at technology choices. We found Figma leading the design group, WordPress leading CMSs, and Contentful as strong competition, with Sanity and Strappy looking like strong newcomers. Unsurprisingly, in the languages, JavaScript is dominant and TypeScript is a really big deal these days and probably worth your time to learn, especially if you work on enterprise software. SQL is more popular than you'd imagine, and Python is well loved. WASM may change the game by allowing us to use any language on the web, not just JavaScript and TypeScript. And then finally, we looked at frameworks. We saw that React is the leader overall and also of component libraries. React is so big it may transcend being a library, and if it doesn't, then Vue and Svelte are lapping at its heels. For server-side generators, we saw that Gatsby remains the favorite and is losing share to challengers like Eleventy. And for kitchen sink frameworks, we saw there's a lot of them, but Next, Nuxt, Vite, and SvelteKit are some of the strongest choices out there. With all of this data, the obvious question is, what should I do? Well, I hope, for one thing, that I haven't been too prescriptive. No choice works for everybody. Everyone has different constraints and preferences. But I hope what I've done here is given you some parameters and a framework, another framework, for making a decision. The web is a big, beautiful, bustling ecosystem in constant change and evolution. I have been a web developer for 25 years now, and I'm still learning things about it every single day. I hope that you found this look at the landscape as invigorating and as fascinating as I did, and I thank you all for your time and attention.
Wow. Laurie, thanks for the talk. And, the amount of data and the amount of the job you've made is just overwhelming.
Overwhelming is what I go for.
I'm impressed, really. So, let's jump to some questions. So the first question is, may you assume that lower mobile support or importance notice is led by growing mobile development in every sphere over these years?
So to make sure I understand the question, do I think that the increasing amount of the increasing importance of mobile is due to the increasing adoption of mobile? Is that the question?
Well, looks like this.
I think I think one of the things that I didn't talk about in this talk when it comes to mobile is the geographical differences in mobile audiences. In some countries, the mobile internet is the only internet, whereas in North America and Europe, desktop internet came first, and so we still tend to think about it in those terms. So I think with our increasing geographical diversity that we saw in the data, we're going to see very different perspectives on the importance of mobile when you split by region as well. I hope that answered the question.
Well, yeah, I hope to. And yes, the next question is what satisfaction actually tells us. I might have missed something, but satisfaction of 2 or 3 still seems quite low. How should those numbers be interpreted?
That's an excellent question. So satisfaction is a ratio. It's not like a rating from 1 to 10. So if a satisfaction score is 2.0, then that means the people who are enthusiastic about your technology outnumber the people who are unenthusiastic about your technology by a ratio of 2 to 1. So a satisfaction score of 10 means they are 10 times as many people are happy with your technology as are unhappy with your technology. So a satisfaction score of 2 is actually very difficult to get. And a satisfaction score of 10 is this sort of unbelievable number where basically everyone's happy, right? At a satisfaction score of 10, 90% of people want to use your technology more.
Okay. Now I get it. Thank you for the question, Dmitry. Now I get it too. So, yes, now I suggest everyone to join a discussion room and talk with Laurie himself. And for now, thank you everyone who joined us today and or tonight. So goodbye to everyone, and thanks. See you later.
Thanks, everybody. I'll see you in the Zoom.